Hi, everyone. This is Gary Cunningham from Alliant Loss Control, and welcome to our webcast, Project Restart during COVID-19. We've invited presenters from 4 disciplines that we think will play a key role not only in projects restarting, but possibly for the foreseeable future. With us today are Mike Cashins, an industrial hygienist from Cashins and Associates, Eric Montplaisir, a fire and life safety engineer from SLS Consulting, Virginia Siegel, a CSP from On-Site Safety and Health involved in worker screening and testing, and Sean Spaziano, the Vice President from the largest emergency response provider in the U.S., Clean Harbors. We know it's a commitment for you to attend our webcast, so we want the presentation to be concise and packed with important Project Restart considerations. Each of the 4 segments will be brief, running about 15 to 20 minutes, filled with information that we think will help you prepare and execute a safe startup when we're allowed back to work. Following the final presentation, we'll conclude with a question and answer session where you'll be able to ask the experts your own questions. But I'm going to start things off with a couple of slides about restarting from a purely occupational safety perspective. Alliant put together a focus group that brainstormed on all the things contractors should be thinking about before resuming work and during work in this new environment. You can see here the entire checklist, and the checklist will be available after the webcast. But I wanted to highlight a few items just to give you an idea about the content of the checklist. You need an adequate supply of face masks, hand sanitizer, hand washing stations before you start work. You can't try to adjust to this on the fly. The number of hand washing stations that you had prior to shutting down will not be adequate when you go back to work. So you need to lay in those supplies before you bring people back to the project site. It's one of the things on the checklist that I just wanted to call attention to. You should create new toolbox talks that will include COVID-19 topics. They can be about social distancing and hand washing, any of the things that you want to convey to people on the job site. And you can be writing those toolbox talks right now so that you're ready to hit the ground running when people start to show up on the project. You could also reformat your site-specific new hire orientation. Again, the things that you want to convey with people, we all know how important new hire orientation is to set the table properly. This is a time to modify your orientation so that you can cover those COVID-19 elements when people start to show up. Another thing from a pure safety standpoint, scaffolds. Scaffolds have been sitting. Who knows how they will left when the project shut down. You need to reinspect all of your scaffolds and stair towers. You have to re-tag everything, put green tags on things. So don't forget to look at those scaffolds again before you have people that you want to put to work there. Same with cranes, elevators, rigging equipment. Check your crane certifications, hoists and elevators. Do they need to be re-inspected? I imagine third-party inspectors could be bombarded with calls. It's something to anticipate before you actually want to start work. And then finally, maintain separation. It sounds so easy, and yet it could be so difficult. And one of the first things that comes to mind is just having workers show up at the project site. You don't want a huge queue of people at the gate trying to get through. You may be doing screening or who knows what, but you don't want people to queue up outside your one gate. So this is a time to think about a new site plan and possibly adding additional gates, so that people can move in and out of the project more easily. Granted, it means more gates that you have to worry about for security, but it could be important in this time with social distancing. So, as I said, the whole checklist will be available after the webcast, along with materials from all the other presenters, but I just wanted to go over those things before we get started with our first presenter. I'd like to introduce Michael Cashins from Cashins and Associates. Mike is a certified industrial hygienist with lots of construction industry experience and a pragmatic approach to problem solving. Mike, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Gary. I'm happy to be here to do a presentation for Alliant, and try to help out everyone with this COVID-19 and re-entering the workforce. So as an industrial hygienist, we look at the virus and the exposure routes and things like that. So we'll start off kind of with a few definitions. Firstly, I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of a background as far as what is a virus. Obviously, that's the concern as workers re-enter the job sites and workplaces. So what exactly is a virus, just so people kind of have a little bit of information on that end. In a technical standpoint, a virus is a chain of nucleic acids which live in a host cell. It also uses parts of the cellular machinery to reproduce and releases the replicated nucleic acid chains to infect more cells. So basically, it's using bodily functions of the host to reproduce and spread. So like a virus for a computer, it's infecting and then needing that body and host and conditions in the host, such as the conditions in a human body or an animal to grow and reproduce. And as a protective factor, they have a protein code or a protein envelope, which allows the virus to survive when it's out of a host. That's why we have transmission from person to person. An important part of that is the disinfectants that we have to use to eradicate the virus has to break that envelope. So we find disinfectants that can break that envelope, in effect, make the virus not infectious. Important terms that we have. I just wanted to go over some of the terminology here in the news. The COVID-19 is the disease that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. Basically, the COVID-19, when people are talking about that, that's the illness that the host receives from having the virus proliferate in the body. We have droplets, which are typically the sneezing droplets, breathing particles of bodily fluid that contain the virus or the virus particle. The virus particle is a very small dried particle from a liquid droplet. And then we have the concentration, which is an amount of something per volume. And studies have shown there are over 200 million virus particles per person's cough if they are infected. So you can see there's a significant amount of transmission through cough and dispersion of those droplets. So how do we assess whether a place is infected or contaminated? Well, right now, as an industrial hygienist, we typically look for air and surface type testing to see what's available on that end to evaluate exposure potential. So as far as the COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 goes, there aren't a lot of tests available currently to directly measure that in air. There are some more surface tests that we can do. In particular, there's an ATP test, which does not confirm that there's virus present, but it is a good test for cleanliness. We can use that in combination with a visual inspection and reviewing protocols that the cleaning contractor has followed to determine if a condition exists that is problematic for reoccupancy. So surface testing for COVID-19, we do have a lab test that we can do a swab, and it's a bioindicator for the coronavirus in general, but it's not going to specifically identify the SARS-CoV-2. We also have a PCR or polymerase chain reaction test for coronavirus, which measures RNA. The issue with that is that even dead components of the virus could show positive results. So even if we get a positive result, it may not necessarily mean that the coronavirus is present in the workplace. So we have to use things in a combination and use professional judgment when we try to evaluate a workplace for the coronavirus. So what are the survival times for COVID-19 or the coronavirus in the work environment? This can be important just to have an idea of what types of surfaces are important to try to disinfect. So currently, since it's a new virus, there wasn't a whole lot of information as far as survival time, but from best knowledge and studies right now that we have, this is the best estimations we have. So on cardboard, their research has shown that it can last 24 hours. In a lot of cases, that envelope dries up, and then the virus becomes ineffective or not infectious. Some studies show that it can last over 3 hours in air, depending on the conditions of the humidity and temperature. We also have common surfaces such as plastic and stainless steel that might be found in a workplace. They're talking 3 days possible survival rate or more. And then on skin, there's some studies say 15 minutes or more, but that's still kind of inexact and not exactly known at this time. But it just shows that we're seeing why it spreads pretty readily, because it does have pretty good survival rates when it's out of a host. And so that's important for the social distancing and things like that, hand washing and PPE use. So how does the virus transmit? As I talked about the social distancing, the CDC is saying stay 6 feet apart when you're in groups of people because of those droplets. A lot of the heavy droplets will drop out of air, and thus being 6 feet away from someone else that's possibly infected will reduce the likelihood or the chances of contracting the COVID-19 disease. We do know that some small particles will last for many hours, so there's still a lot of question as to what's the relevance of that, and we really don't know how much viral particles are required to cause someone to become infected. So 6 feet seems to be a reasonable distance to keep to maintain exposure reduction to the large particles, which are more likely to cause infection with someone being in proximate distance to an infected individual. So respiratory exposure, transmission generally occurs most commonly through inhalation. We know that the dispersion of those particles is the primary route to get the virus into you as a host. The exposure happens when droplet nuclei, after someone coughs or sneezes, enters your body, and then the virus can start growing and reproducing readily in your biosystem. Well, transmission from contact with contaminated or hard or soft surfaces has not been documented really well for this SARS-CoV-2. It is a mode of transmission that's common among other respiratory pathogens, such as the flu. Based on that information and the similarities in a lot of cases, and the other types of severe acute respiratory syndrome type viruses, it is thought that hand-to-face contact is another primary route for transmitting. So if you touch a surface that has the SARS-CoV-2 virus, you could easily touch your face inadvertently, to rub your eyes, things like that, and then end up contracting the COVID-19 disease. So how do we classify workplace risk? So jobs that have higher exposures, such as healthcare workers, are going to be a very high risk, and people that are in dense populations are going to be high risk. Again, just because the more people that are congregated, we're going to have greater chance for spreading the COVID-19 disease to others. That's why we have the practices of minimal crowds and social distancing and isolation in place right now in society. But what do we do to evaluate that when we're going back to work and things kind of get back underway in a more normal condition? So level of risk is going to be dependent upon the industry type that you're in, the need for contact with others, and obviously the requirement for extended contact is going to dramatically change the level of risk in a workplace. So unless we're actively engaged in healthcare and emergency medical support services, most likely the exposure risk will fall in the low to medium range, depending on the particular job site conditions that are present. So what are the steps that all employers can take to reduce risk for returning workers and visitors? Employers should develop an infectious disease preparedness and response plan. This plan would include just different conditions as far as what needs to be done to return to work, prepare and implement basic infection prevention measures such as routine cleaning of high-touch surfaces, policies and procedures for prompt identification and isolation of sick people, if appropriate. So do you need a screening process for people entering the site or the building, such as taking temperatures or doing interviews, asking questions about their contact with people, things like that, to try to evaluate current workers as they come into the site and prevent those people that maybe have been exposed or have been in contact with infected individuals from further transferring the virus to your current workforce. Other things that can be done that are pretty simple are try to limit site meetings, spread workers out. So if you have a larger building and you're staging it, maybe you can stage it in a different fashion where you spread the workforce into different areas of the building. Introduction of fresh air. So if you have a sealed building, just airflow can help dramatically with reducing and diluting any of those small lingering virus-containing droplets that might be floating around. It's important to note that a lot of those small droplets can linger in air for, as the studies have shown, over 3 hours and maybe even longer. And they're small and buoyant and just kind of float around, mimicking the airflow patterns like a gas would. So the more fresh air you can get in, the greater chance of flushing that out and minimizing repeated exposure to lingering droplets that may contain the SARS-CoV-2 virus particle. Available controls that we have are typical for a lot of industrial hygiene things, but in this case, we're looking at preventive maintenance cleaning, as we said, deconning or cleaning doorknobs and railings and elevator buttons or things like that that are high-touch, frequent surfaces. And then if we do an evaluation or we know that someone had the virus and was in the space, we would do decontamination cleaning, which would be more specialized, higher level deep clean, using special cleaners to, again, break that viral envelope to kill any potential virus from being there. As we talked about, using more ventilation, outside air flow into a space. We can also use HEPA filtration if windows aren't available, or if it's like a basement area. We can set up kind of the ventilation system with HEPA filters that will screen and filter the virus from air. Isolation techniques such as dividing workplaces, setting up barriers between groups of people. Heat has also been utilized with some success, but it's probably not the most practical. This might work for spot treatment of areas, but high heat, 167 degrees on a surface, can and will kill all viruses. So that's why when workers have clothing or things like that that possibly become contaminated, you can put in a high heat washer, and then the high heat of the drying process, if you put it through a mechanical dryer, would kill the virus. So I think the most important aspect of all this is screening, isolating, trying to maintain the social distancing. And then there's also a process in your work plan that could have someone like us evaluate the level of cleanliness that has been achieved. As we talked about, there's a few tests available that we can utilize to ensure that the occupants returning to work or returning to a building are assured that there's a level of safety and a decent standard of care have been taken following protocols that are recommended by the CDC. And that way we can all be somewhat assured that the workplace is in a good condition as people return to the buildings and the construction job sites. That's what I wanted to go over today. I thank you for your attention, and honor to be involved in this project. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike, for breaking down some of the science and mitigation steps through this crisis. I'd like to welcome Eric Montplaisir. He's a registered professional fire protection engineer from SLS Consulting. Eric will cover that critical part of Project Restart. I'll turn things over to Eric.
Thanks, Gary. So like Gary said, my firm is a fire and life safety consulting firm. We are generally fire protection engineers and contracting professionals. So we bring a little bit of a different take to this remobilization than some of the others. Our take on this is generally based in the fire code. I just want to be clear that we are not advocating return to business. We're not pushing it. What we're trying to say is when the time has come or when everyone's ready and when it's safe, we just want to support it from a fire and life safety standpoint and provide guidance on how to do it safely. So we generally see this in two separate ways, how to remobilize a construction site that's been shut down. The first part of it is we want to recognize that the site has been shut down for a period of time, and then we want to recognize that the site may not look the same when it starts up than it did the day you left the site. There's two things going on for the way that we're providing guidance on how to remobilize the site. It's mostly heavily rooted in compliance with NFPA 241, and then there's also some consideration of the way that a site will be altered based off of guidance from OSHA to adapt active construction sites to the world we live in today. So NFPA 241 is it's the construction safety, safeguarding construction, alteration, and demolition activities. It's a NFPA standard. It's relatively high level. It's supposed to apply to all construction sites, and it has a lot of information there, but it's not site specific. So questions that we're asking in going through this is, how was the site shut down originally? Was it haphazard? Was it methodical? What things would have happened when the site was shut down? What happened to the fire protection systems when the site was shut down versus when it's being opened? I think the bigger question is, what is the current status of the site? So we're developing a checklist to figure out what the status is of certain aspects of the site. We take the NFPA 241 guidance, which, like I said, is kind of applicable generally across the board, and we make it site-specific into a checklist that can be used by someone implementing that checklist. So what's needed to get up and running? The checklist that we're developing for these sites is not intended to meet the requirements of fire codes and NFPA 241 entirely. We're making an assumption that the site has an NFPA 241 construction fire safety plan. The first bullet that we have in the checklist is, does the site have a plan? NFPA 241 is largely adopted across the country by state and local fire codes. It's adopted by the International Fire Code, and it's adopted by NFPA 1, which is NFPA's version of the fire code, serving as the model code for several jurisdictions. So it's already administratively in place in most places across the country. In some places, it's enforced heavily by jurisdictions, and in others, it isn't. And that's not to say that it's not in the code, and it is the contractor's responsibility to meet those requirements, whether or not it's enforced on the local level. So what NFPA 241 does is it ensures that construction activities are safeguarded by all kinds of different aspects. One of the biggest things that we're trying to do is create accountability on the site. So we would assign a fire protection program manager who manages all these programs. There's things to consider, like temporary enclosures, fire protection systems. All those things have to be managed, and there's requirements in NFPA 241 relative to all of those. With respect to the differences that you may see on the construction site after it's up and running versus how it was left, some of those things are going to be rooted in OSHA's guidance and how to operate a construction site during a pandemic. A couple examples are, I know some guidance is saying that you're bringing in additional bathrooms or hand washing stations, which could be running water, which could be hand sanitizer. NFPA 241 has requirements on temporary structures and separation from the main structure. How are those things being considered when you're bringing these things on? Hand sanitizer is a Class 1B flammable liquid in most cases, sometimes even Class 1A. So there are limitations on the quantity that you can bring on site. Who's managing that? And not only that is, when the site was demobilized and the site was shut down, were hazardous materials left on site? And if so, what quantity was left? And who's coordinating the quantity with, everything that's being brought onto site now? So again, there's a big accountability issue of this, and we're looking to assign someone who's knowledgeable on the fire and life safety side to run this program. If one already isn't created, then one should be created. If one is created, then this checklist that we're working on is intended to be a supplement to that. I think it's a good time once you're remobilizing to sort of take the pulse of the project, to make sure that inspections are current, make sure that combustible waste hasn't accumulated, and we're looking at things like that have, sort of a cascading effect. Like when the site was shut down, did everyone dispose of combustible materials in the dumpster? Is the dumpster overfilled? Does it need to be emptied? Has the service been shut off for that? If the service hasn't shut off for that, maybe the waste management company came, they emptied the dumpster, they put it in front of a Knox box, an entrance to the site, or they put it in front of, blocking a fire apparatus lane. Or maybe the local residents noticed that the site was shut down for the past month and they started using a fire lane to park. So there's all things like that there's just so many different aspects that we think a checklist is the way to go. But I do think when adapting NFPA 241 to create a checklist, there's just so much information in NFPA 241 that isn't going to be applicable to so many sites that we do think it's in the site's best interest and the fire protection program manager's best interest to really tailor that program to what the site is doing. So like I was saying before, there's parts of this that are, we'll call it the components. The life safety systems, have the valves been checked, the line valves been checked so that they're open. Are the trash chutes, clogged? Is the sprinkler head at the top of the trash chute recharged? These are kind of component aspects of the remobilization plan. I guess another example would be site security fences. Are they still intact since the site has been shut down? Is there gaps in them? Site security is obviously a theft and vandalism issue, but it is very much a fire issue as well. So it's kind of that part of it. And then there's also the management side of it. There's the services and the jurisdiction, and the responsibility of the fire protection program manager is also to ensure that if you had a site security company, that person is re-engaged, that the fire protection program manager would be responsible for contacting the local jurisdiction to say, hey, we're up and running. We need to do hot work. What's your process right now for fire watches? Are you doing them? If they're not doing fire watches, they're requiring them for doing hot work, then your site is going to be crippled in a way that you'll have to figure out how you're going to do hot work without a fire watch from the local jurisdiction. And I guess that's a good point to jump off and say, talk to your local jurisdictions about this. A lot of language in NFPA 241 is as approved, and that's NFPA's way of saying, talk to your fire department or talk to your jurisdiction. What things do they want to see? So again, with the coordination aspect of it, you have different construction sites. You have ground up new construction. You have tenant fit outs in buildings. You have demolition operations. So if you consider like a construction tenant fit out, you could have multiple sites going on in the building at the same time. So another reason for establishing an NFPA 241 plan is to ensure that all the construction activities within single building are coordinated. So if you have your fire protection program manager of construction site A, perhaps working on floor 3 of a building, and then you would have another fire protection program manager for site B or project B on floor 5, or maybe floor 4, so someone needs to coordinate to to ensure that the fire protection systems are not being impaired over multiple floors. So NFPA 241 has guidance on and requirements to not impair those sequential floors and provide buffer floors for fire protection impairments. It's really important to establish that person and have accountability so that they can handle some of these issues. Another thing that we're seeing here as a result of the COVID-19 stuff, we want to increase ventilation to job sites. So there's temporary enclosures that are being removed, and it's what's happening with those temporary enclosures. Where are you storing them? Kind of going back to the hand washing station issue. Are you providing water to the site? Is there more trash barrels that need to be emptied? Are those trash barrels obstructing egress paths? All of those things that if you're not considering NFPA 241 from a site safety standpoint, you're probably just putting them on there in a functional way. Speaking to the social distancing aspect of an active construction site and the way that we're seeing some contractors or some jurisdictions want to see this implemented to stagger shifts or stagger trades to try to cut down on the density of each job site. So that kind of lends itself to some conflicts, right? So you would say, which trade am I going to have on which floor? Who takes priority? So, for us, it's easy. NFPA 241 prioritizes the installation of fire protection systems. So your fire protection contractor or your fire alarm contractor should have priority over other contractors whenever possible. And that's already, in the fire code, and it's in NFPA 241. It's just, it needs to be implemented. The other part of it is cleaning crews. So now you're probably bringing in more cleaning crews. Who's training those people? Who's telling them how to store their equipment? Things like that, I think need to be considered. So as part of the NFPA 241 plan, in a perfect world, this thing is developed, submitted for permit, the jurisdiction agrees to it, and then it's operated, and it's a living document over the course of the job. One of the parts that is most moving is the pre-fire plan. So the pre-fire plan is established with the NFPA 241 plan, and when the jurisdiction, the fire department responds to the site, it's likely one of the first documents that they'll ask for. The pre-fire plan says, where the stairs are, where the hazardous materials are stored, where is the sprinkler room, where are the utility connections, emergency shutoffs, things like that. As you guys know, the construction site is ever changing. So the pre-fire plan should be updated commensurate with those changes. In a site shutdown, as part of the demobilization process, as part of the shutdown process, there could be some things that you're doing that are no longer aligned with your pre-fire plan. Likewise, when you're starting up the job, where's your BFD command post? Did someone use that as a storage room? Does that need to be cleaned out? Also, considerations of adjacent sites. If there's a couple construction sites that are next to each other, typically a pre-fire plan is going to indicate some clearances to job sites and some access points for the fire department. Has an adjacent job site advanced such that some of those areas are obstructed or some of those distances aren't accurate anymore? The pre-fire plan needs to be updated to reflect any of those changes. Going back to what I was talking about before with the firefighter apparatus, access roads, have those been obstructed? Fire hydrant locations and availability. If there's a fire hydrant inside the construction fencing, has someone parked a vehicle next to it? Is it something that needs to be addressed? Fire department connections and locations, same thing within the building. Not only the connections and locations, but like I said, the valves leading up to them. Are they open? Is there a cap on the FDC? Construction fencing, again, is it intact? Are the keys in the Knox box? Does the fire department have access? Are the access gates in the same part of the job that they were when you left? If you have, a single access point before this, under the COVID-19 new job site, maybe you're providing multiple access points to try to space people out. Those access points need to be identified on the pre-fire plan and available to the fire department. So when they're responding, they're getting the most accurate and up-to-date information. Now, I think the other part of it, the same thing with the pre-fire plan, but hazardous materials, obviously a huge issue on a job site. Is the storage of those, the location indicated on the pre-fire plan, is that accurate? And again, the quantities, are you staying within the maximum allowable limits? Dumpster location, same thing. Where is that? Did it move? Does it need to be updated? utility connections, are they obstructed based on the shutdown? These are pretty serious questions, I think, that need to be asked. And so our goal, like I said, this is what you're seeing on this slide is kind of a snippet of what the checklist we're developing, but our goal is to provide each project with a comprehensive but also site-specific list that has accountability, and a manager can run through and say yes, no, in some cases not applicable, and then why. And then that list would be part of a supplement to the NFPA 241 plan as it's created. I think that's all I have today. That's my last slide. I think I have some take-home brochures and materials with contact information, so I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks very much, Eric, for a lot of critical information for contractors and owners to consider. A topic that's been talked about a lot in media reports is worker screening and testing. That might become an element in your returning to work, and we've invited Virginia Siegel from On-Site Safety and Health to present. Here's Virginia.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me on. I would like to speak with you about some of the nuts and bolts on implementing a virus protection plan. On-Site has been fortunate enough to stay open during this time because we have been supporting essential construction sites. So with that, we've done a lot of practice. It seems like 1 month is like 1 year of trial and error, and so I will bring to you as much experience as I can from that. We'll talk mostly about how to add, it's a temporary measure, but how to effectively add it to existing programs, and then review the components that are being used by contractors across the nation. You'll get to benefit from all the lessons that everybody else learned. Adding this temporary measure to existing programs is a little bit of a challenge, and so we're all doing it, we're all adding. It's kind of a step-by-step process. Again, I would suggest that you take what you get from this webinar and maybe talk to other folks who were able to stay open. As close as you can to what you're currently doing would be the best way to implement something that's new. And remember, hopefully it is only temporary. Some of the components that you're going to want to focus on are written plans. That's your control document. So you have to have your written plans, but that shouldn't be new. In construction, we have to have written plans for everything. So we just add to our existing written plans a program to protect workers from this hazard. It's a hazard that we have to respect. Just like all hazards that we face in construction, we have to respect those hazards and write into our plans things to do to protect people. Folks have used questionnaires. I'll talk a little bit about that and how those have worked. Lots of people are doing temperature checks. That seems to be becoming the standard, and lots of folks are doing that. Different states have different requirements, but if you are faced with that requirement, it's much easier to make that happen now than it was a month ago because so many have implemented that practice. And then last but not least, I'll talk about blood testing for antibodies. That's been all over the news. And now, well, we were able to do that right at construction sites, and I know that we're not the only ones. So it is reasonable to, at some point, implement testing at the site if that makes sense for you. And then at the end, I'll offer to share posters and handouts to anyone who wants them. Just ask me for them in the Q&A time. Okay, but before I start, I want to make a point. This is perhaps some personal experience and certainly experience that many contractors have felt, and that is that with the news being what it is and the hyperbole associated with the sensational headlines and the fear that that's brought, there's a psychological impact to opening and staying open in the first place and then reopening. But just don't forget that staying open is good business, or reopening as soon as you can feel that you can safely reopen, it's good business. That's my personal input. Staying open is good business. Remember that as business leaders, we have a lot of responsibilities, and economic health is important. And opening up your job sites and allowing people to come back to work creates a lot of talk and a lot of culture. And I felt that we've had to stand strong and say, look, we can keep people safe from this hazard and also care for the economic and social health of our workers and our company. And I just want to tell you it's okay to feel that way and to be prepared, perhaps with short, concise, respectful answers if those questions are presented. A healthy company can adjust in times of hardship and keep people safely employed. I am looking back, I'm not so sure that we were ready for this. My company, I felt, I guess, that first day that we got hit with a meteor on our heads. And I'm very grateful to look back and have been able to adjust to stay open. And now that your folks are going to be coming back to work, your sites are going to start opening, you're going to have to adjust. But I would say to look at it this way: if you're able to open safely and adjust and keep people safely working and assist with economic and social health, then you probably have a pretty healthy company and you should be proud of it. Okay, again, making these new components connect to something that you're accustomed to, I have found has been the most successful. We've had a lot of trial and error. Just add an element to your safety meetings, but keep your safety meetings on the same day and the same time so that you're not changing everything for your workers, because workers are going to need to be comfortable with this. This won't be a whole lot different than anything else, and that you need people to comply with whatever it is you're asking them to do. So making it something that looks like what they're used to seems to be the most effective. You know, having people wash their hands and keep from transmitting flu and cold viruses on each other is something that we always should have been doing. So whatever it is that you put in place to encourage them to do that, make sure it's something that they can comfortably do. Maybe you add some extra hand wash stations. Okay, you're going to start with your written plan. And your written plan in this case is very important. Well, I think as safety professionals, we always think that written plans are very important. This time it really is, because you're not the only one looking at it. And with you opening up, this is your governing document. So I would say be careful. An IH is a good person to write this document. A person with CSP or CHST, you know, qualifications to write that document for you, I would strongly suggest that you take advantage of such a person. Don't have to. There's no explicit requirement that I know of that says you have to have this sort of qualification to write the plan, but to have that person's name on there, I think, is good practice. Following the CDC guidelines is not terrible. They're not terrible guidelines to follow. You can post them. You can ask people to follow these things without too much trouble, at least in my experience, but be sure you follow them. Sometimes CDC guidelines are not that easy to follow, but these are pretty intuitive. Your sanitation practices, again, you're going to have to put that in your plan. I would recommend that you're careful with what you put. For sure include that you need to have a sanitation program in place, but don't box yourself in and say that you're going to do XYZ exactly this way with exactly this cleaner, because things change, access to supplies changes. Just I would recommend that you put in your plan that you're going to use an effective sanitation program, and be sure that you implement something that you can practically implement. PPE, you already assign people PPE. If you are doing pre-employment drug testing or a pre-employment physical, just add the assignment of a facial mask to that practice. If you're doing an onboarding program with a new hire orientation, add the familiarity with this extra PPE to that existing program. So it takes 5 minutes. It's not a big change that's going to be difficult for you to efficiently implement. Be particularly careful with respirators. If you make mandatory that people wear a tight-fitting face piece respirator, even an N95, OSHA has been very clear that they're expecting, at least in most states, that you do the medical clearance and fit test associated with wearing that respirator, and that's cumbersome, not necessarily impossible, and lots of folks are doing that. That's one of the things my company does, but you shouldn't do that, in my opinion, unless you really have to. Those little, like the mask in the picture, the little ones that are cloth and go around your ears, those are not tight-fitting face pieces. Those do not require medical clearance and fit testing, and they do the trick because they're blocking any of your fit from getting out of your respiratory system into the air, so you're not transmitting or potentially transmitting any virus organisms, and they also help you to keep from touching your face. So my own company, where we have mandatory requirements for respirators for folks that are doing temperature checks, everybody is wearing this cloth mask, and we can require that without having to do a medical clearance or fit test. If you do decide that you're going to have some kind of control set up at the gate, some folks set it up at the gate in the morning before work, some at lunchtime, some after work. Some are using systems like the little bracelet you get when you go to the water park. They have a different color every day, and they're requiring people at a certain time every day, maybe end a shift, and then they're given the bracelet to come in the morning. Most folks want to do this in the morning before people get to work. Some are not using any bracelet or ticket. They're just visually seeing people checked off as they come in. Make sure you manage your distance between employees. In the very, very beginning, I think the very first day, the second day, I think we were doing temperature checks at one of the big projects considered essential. The folks outside got too close together, and even though they weren't touching each other, they weren't managing that 6-foot distance, and sure enough, if those pictures didn't end up on social media, and the one side of the political argument pointing out to the other side that we're, putting people at risk and all the stuff that goes. So see to it that your guys are standing that 6 feet apart as they're waiting to get in the gate. Folks have used, channelizers, cones, even so much as K-rail in some cases, but that's a little over the top. But ropes and things with X's on the ground that show people where they can stand so that they have that distance while they're waiting to get in the gate. Most people are using in-house administrative staff to administer questionnaires if they've chosen to use questionnaires. The questionnaires that we've seen and even have, I think, as a handout at the end if you want to just have a sample, are very simple. They're essentially saying, do you have any symptoms? These are the symptoms. Do you have a fever? Yes or no? Sign here. And that's working for a lot of companies. It's simple, it's inexpensive, and I think it's working. More and more people are adding the component that includes the taking of temperatures. That has its own issues, but again, we've had enough practice, and there's lots of folks all across the company doing this, that setup has become pretty routine. You set up in a place with ambient temperature. At first, we were doing temperature checks on the East Coast when it was 40 degrees outside, and of course, nobody had a fever, and that didn't work for, that was one of the errors that we had to fix. So you set up so that you have ambient temperature, a little bit of privacy. Some locales are requiring the use of a third party. Some people are doing that in-house. You can get training. I know it's only a thermometer, but you still, if you're going to use in-house people, you want to train them on any of the hazards that they may face if they're taking temperatures from employees, how to make sure that they're not causing cross-contamination with the thermometer. Again, lots of folks are doing that in-house. Lots of folks are using a third party, usually associated with a general contractor or owner or government requirement. A lot of things that you can do are very simple. You can stagger start times. If you're on a multi-employer site, see if you're a subcontractor, maybe find out when everybody else is going to work and see if you can change your start time. Lots of people have relaxed those requirements. I know a month ago when you said you were going to change your start time, the world came to an end. But now changing your start time has become good practice, and so we're staggering people coming into the sites. Setting up signs that follow CDC recommendations, very good. Even though people know that stuff, it does a couple things. It demonstrates your effort to be respectful of the hazard. It also reminds people of the things, I don't know, wash your hands, wear your mask, stand far apart, use social distancing. Those continual reminders never hurt. And then last but not least, we have a handout, and it's when a worker actually has a fever of 100.4 or greater. That 100.4 was set by CDC. If they have that fever or if they have symptoms, we just hand them the handout, and it really says go home, quarantine, call your doctor. In addition to that handout, you do need to have a plan in place for what you're going to do if someone shows up for work and does have symptoms and needs to be sent home, or if they do show up for work and they came on the job site and did get exposed to people, you want to have a plan for that. Last but not least, we and lots of other companies, I'm sure, are out doing blood testing out on job sites with little kits that give immediate results for antibody tests. I am amazed at how much the fear is reduced when a person sees with their own eyes that they don't have the antibodies for the virus in their system. Now, even me, I'm a little on the cynical side. Even I feel wonderful when someone I care about sees that they don't have the antibodies for the virus in their system. So there are lots of kits out on the market that the FDA has approved for this emergency time, and those kits are for presumptive results only, meaning they're not confirmed have or don't have the virus. They're presumptive only. Very useful so far in the construction industry. When we find somebody who has symptoms and antibodies build up in your system when your body is fighting the virus. That's what your body always does. When a virus comes in to your respiratory system, your body makes antibodies. So if you're symptomatic and you have antibodies, and it stands to reason that your body is fighting off the virus. So we just send them home, and they have to go home to their doctor, or they've already been sent home, and companies are having people drive up in their car. The technician or the phlebotomist is standing outside. You can actually do this test with the person in their car. We have a very large company on the West Coast that has set that up for all their people. If they meet the requirements for testing, they can drive up. They don't actually even get out of their car, and they can do this testing. So these are very inexpensive. They're becoming more and more available in the industry. And I'd be careful. You don't just wantonly implement this, but you have folks in your world that are the ones that maybe wrote your program, your health and safety folks that can help you implement something like this. Very, very reasonable, and I think a good way to help reduce the fear. The fear is every bit as dangerous, in my opinion, as the virus. So that's what I have, folks. I've got some handouts. They're listed here on this last slide, and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for some great content with real-world applications. We're really pleased to have a representative from Clean Harbors to speak with authority about a topic, cleaning and disinfecting, that has often been overlooked in construction. I'll turn things over now to Sean Spaziani. Sean?
Thanks, Gary. I really appreciate it. And the first thing I want to do is thank Alliant Insurance Services for having me here today. Clean Harbors has been on the front line of the COVID response, and at our very core, we're an emergency response company. We've been in this business for over 40 years dealing with infectious disease, all the way from H1N1 to the avian flu to the response to 9/11. One of the biggest things that we want to provide today is the insight that we've gained from businesses as we've been working through this challenge. We have been serving as much as a consultant in this environment as we have been as far as actually doing jobs. Even though we've done over 2,000 jobs already, the real thing is, what do businesses do today? So I'm going to share with you some best practices for businesses today and maybe some new ways to think about how to think about COVID and what's next for all of us. So we're going to go ahead and jump into probably one of the biggest questions I get, which is there's so many new terms, Sean. There's a whole new vernacular in our business today, like disinfection and decontamination and fogging. Can you please help us understand what this means and make sure we're doing the right thing? And then the other one is, how should we be thinking about managing COVID-19 at our facility, from prevention to what happens if we have an infection, all the way to just business continuity? What is this new world going to look like? We don't have a business plan for this. And so what we've done is kind of consolidate all of our feedback from all of our partners that we'd like to share today. So we're going to start with probably the biggest conversation, which is disinfection versus decontamination. So what is the difference between the two and when do they apply? So let's start with what is disinfection. Disinfection is the general cleaning of your facility using CDC-approved chemicals. The most important thing to remember here is to, one, use an organization whose people are properly trained and they have the proper PPE when they enter your facility. There are a lot of organizations that are coming in that are not qualified to perform this service, and you don't want the workers that are trying to help you getting sick. You also want to make sure that your facility is properly disinfected by a company that understands infectious disease. So they're coming in with a lower level of PPE because the assumption here is, and this is the best way to remember the difference, is disinfection is most appropriate when there is no known, possible, or plausible presence of the virus. So they come in, they disinfect, they've got a proper level of PPE, they wipe down the facility, They understand time on material. That's the other thing I'd like to leave you with. Whether it's a hard surface, a porous surface, a non-porous surface, couches, no matter what's in your space, that chemical has to remain on certain materials for a certain amount of times to be effective against the virus. So it's okay to ask your supplier or your vendor or your partner to talk to you about time on material and to make sure that they've got a deep understanding of that before they come into your facility. This is going to be the biggest part of business continuity going forward. Now let's talk about what is decontamination. Decontamination is most applicable when there is a known, possible, or plausible presence of the virus. When Clean Harbors comes into a facility in a decontamination scenario, it is all about the destruction of the virus. So they assume the presence of the virus. You want a company that understands that. They come in, they've got full PPE, they understand the OSHA, EPA, and CDC requirements, they've got bonded materials, full-face respirators, and they are coming in to kill a virus. There are technologies that are used from fogging to misting to application, and sometimes a combination of all three. You want to make sure the applications that they're using are approved by the CDC, and the CDC has done a great job of documenting all of the approved processes. There's a lot of information flying around in our world today, but you can just double check it against the CDC. Is this an experiment? You don't want to become part of an experiment. So make sure that they're using approved processes, approved chemicals, and they are coming in to decontaminate an environment where there is a known, possible, or plausible presence of the virus. So that's the key difference between disinfection and decontamination. Then the other thing we think that we can help businesses with after talking to hundreds of businesses across America on a weekly basis is the three components to a business plan. People say, how do I think about this, Sean? What can we be doing right now? What should we be thinking about as far as building these new business plans that we've never had in place before? So we start with preparedness. Selecting the right partner is absolutely critical. You can do that now. You have time to do research now. Sign the necessary agreements. Establish your processes and procedures. Probably the most important is your communication plan. People don't think about this until something happens, but there's so much value here. You can build a communication plan to talk to your employees, your customers, and the general public about these are the choices that we've made. Here's how we're going to be managing our business. This is why you're going to be safe going forward. Then you can also build communication plans for what if I have an event? What if I do have a known, possible, or plausible presence of the virus and I have to decontaminate? How do I communicate to these same valuable partners? And so building those communication plans and drafting those notes up front is absolutely critical to an effective plan. So preparedness is critical as a first step. Now we get into the second element of a proper business plan, which is business continuity. And I think this is the most pressing subject matter today. We're getting ready to go back to work. Okay, what does that look like? What is this new world that we're going to be living in? So understand the difference between an event versus establishing the right plan to get your business back running and keep it that way are two very different things. An event, think about decontamination, think about a presence of the virus. Ongoing, think about disinfection. What does my employee set need to know and understand and feel good? What's it going to take for them to feel good about entering that workspace, as well as my potential customers, as well as the public and the communities that we operate in? So business continuity is centered around disinfection, ongoing disinfection, and the realization that's not going away. It's going to take a while before people feel comfortable entering spaces until they know exactly what the processes and procedures are that that business is following to keep them safe. It's a critical element going forward. Then lastly is response, and we spent some time on this already when we discussed decontamination. But this, again, begins with preparedness. If you have the right partner, and that partner is qualified, and they have the right experience, expertise, the right scale, and the right supply chain, then you're all set. You've done a great job. So as long as you've got those phone numbers and you've got a partner that has laid out the process for what happens you have an event, all you're left with is, what do I do with my own personnel and my own immediate environment if I have an event? So about communicating to them, then letting them know, don't worry, we've got this handled. We had an event. We've had a diagnosis, a positive diagnosis, whatever it might be. We have a possible diagnosis. So here's what we're going to do to keep you safe. We have the right partners. We have the right processes. Everything's going to be okay. So having those communication plans and having the right partner in place for response is absolutely critical going forward. So if you think about your business plan in those three elements, then you can begin to build a structure to it and select the right partners and be prepared, and that'll give you an edge going forward. So that's basically what we wanted to share today, and those are the critical elements of the thought process as we get back to work, the difference between disinfection, decontamination, and the three elements of an appropriate business plan. Again, I'd like to thank Alliant Insurance Services for allowing Clean Harbors to be a part of this call today, and I wish all of you a safe return to business. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sean, for bringing clarity to an element that's going to be really important for both the restart process and ongoing operations in this new environment. I'd like to thank Sean Spaziani, Mike Cashins, Eric Montplaisir, and Virginia Siegel for presenting today. We'll open things up now for your questions via the WebEx chat feature, and our experts are standing by to answer your questions. We basically tried to give you some things to think about to start the planning process for restart. We're sure you have some additional questions, and we want you to ask the panel those questions now. We've concluded the initial presentations. Send the questions, and we'll talk as long as we have to answer all of your questions. We're all hoping to get back to work soon, but as the presenters have made clear, the most successful restarts will be the jobs that spend time planning and anticipating this new environment.